the book, you and your co-authors write that whether you make a decision only once or 100 times, your goal should be to make it in a way that reduces both bias and noise, and practices that reduce error should be just as effective in your one-of-a-kind decisions as in your repeated ones. And there's a lot here in this just brief quote and a lot that isn't. So, I mean, here you don't say how to reduce bias and noise. So maybe this is more of a meta question, but is the implication that regardless of the sort of choice you're making, like whether it's recurrent or not, the strategy for noise and bias reduction is to have a systematic way of making judgments? The key here being that the system is geared to be impartial. And then I suppose a second question here before we get into the specifics is whether eliminating bias or noise is more important than the other. And I know that's a pretty big question.
Well, with respect to the unique decision versus repeated decision, Olivier Simony invented a phrase that I really like a lot, which is that a unique event is really a repeated event that happens only once. So there is no, qualitative significant difference between the unique and the repeated. So any procedure that you have to reduce error in repeated judgment is, if feasible in the individual case, applicable to the individual unique decision. So that's how the logic goes. It's not, of course, we don't go into the philosophy of unique versus repeated. We just say that the prescriptive advice that we can develop and test to some extent in the repeated case, that prescriptive advice, the logic says it should be applicable to unique decision. Then you asked me about noise and bias. And so clearly, they're quite different in the ways that you can deal with them. In the first place, there is a recipe for eliminating noise completely, which really does not exist for bias. And the recipe for eliminating noise is obtain multiple independent judgments of the same object. When you average multiple judgments, you can drive the noise to zero. However, averaging multiple judgments does not touch bias. What is the so-called wisdom of the crowd means averaging many judgments. It eliminates bias and it doesn't touch noise. So that's one very important difference, that there is a way of reducing noise in principle. And then to reduce bias, you want to deal with the specific problem that you have and ask, how could I go after making a judgment or a decision in that specific problem? How could I do that in a way that reduces bias as much as possible? So you've got to figure out what the bias will be and then try to reduce it. In dealing with noise, there's a different way of looking at it, which we call decision hygiene. And that's, instead of a vaccine or a medication which are specific to a disease, hygiene is completely unspecific. When you wash your hands, you don't know what germs you're killing, and you will never know. I mean, that's just part of what hygiene is. So we came up with that notion of decision hygiene, and that's basically a set of procedures of judgment and decision making that we think generally reduce error, and in particular, we believe they reduce noise.
Mm-hmm. And now, there's this old adage in the business world that what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And seeing as noise has received such little attention, presumably people I mean, you mentioned earlier, I think there's 5 times more noise than people actually imagine there is. So they don't know how much there is or how to spot it. And if we want to reduce it, do we need to know where it is? Are there places people should look for noise or especially effective ways of locating it? Or just go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's entirely, it's absolutely essential to recognize the existence of noise before you do anything about it. And so we recommend noise audits as a way of measuring how much noise there is in the judgments that an organization produces. All this talk is, all this prescriptive advice is addressed to organizations, not so much to individuals. So an organization faces a problem of noise if the different underwriters of an insurance company will come up with different numbers. This is costly to the organization. So the organization will want to reduce noise, and of course it will also want to reduce bias. It will want the pricing neither to be too high nor too low. Decision hygiene are steps that could be suggested or imposed on the functionaries who perform a particular task, like underwriters or judges. And it's a procedure that is intended to promote or facilitate accurate judgment and to reduce error. And there are certain things we know, certain steps we know, that on average reduce error to some extent.
Why? I'm just curious. Is the noise audit and the prescriptions in the book, well, why are they more geared toward organizations than individuals? Is it because you think the book is more geared toward fixing noise in organizations, or it's just harder to make prescriptions for individuals?
I think I think making prescriptions for individual is to a significant extent a waste of time. I mean that was a position I took in Thinking Fast and Slow, which was done, many years earlier, 10 years earlier. Um, and I don't think that people can make themselves slow down and they can try to think logically. So there's obvious advice that you can give individuals. But by and large, it's going to be very difficult for people to change the way they think because so much of thinking is intuitive and there's so little that we can do to improve intuition. Organizations have procedures, and organizations, in the terms of my earlier book, Thinking Fast and Slow, organizations think slowly. And so, by the very nature of having to deliberate on, in making decisions in the organizational context, so there is room for action, for intervention with organization that doesn't exist with individuals.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually thought though that your bias observation checklist for reducing bias in decision making that's contained in, I think it's Appendix C in Noise, is great though, not just for decision observers, quote unquote decision observers in an organization, but that it could also be employed by individuals making their own major decisions, so long as they kind of reword the questions accordingly. Naturally, I mean, you said people think quite intuitively. I think it's a big ask for people to use the questionnaire like this for everyday decisions, but it could be useful if somebody really wants to make a concerted effort to have a reasonable, unbiased major decision.
Yeah, I think Benjamin Franklin already had something similar.
Okay.
That's when you face a major decision, you make a list of the pluses and of the minuses, and then you look and try to find the balance. So, in one way or another, that's the kind of advice that can be given to individuals for special occasions. It's primarily slow down, get advice, sleep over it, and try to make a list. Sure.
So engage system two rather
and
than.
basically engage system two.
Mhm. But of course, his checklist would have lacked the specific output that came from your work with Tversky. But mhm.
Whether that's an important, whether that's important or not, I don't know. I mean, it's not. Notice that what he's focused on is not focused on how could I make a mistake, which would be come more naturally from our work on biases, but his focus is on what are the important considerations in this problem, and that's a perfectly fine approach to take. It's also sometimes you can catch yourself saying, "Well, I'm prone to be biased in this particular direction because of a very recent experience that I had." So I know that that very recent experience will have affected me more than it should, and so I'll resist it. So there are ways in which people can resist biases. Otherwise, Franklin's advice is pretty good.